Now, essentially, as an introduction, I'm Stephen H. Smith. I use H because there's a lot of Stephen Smiths in York County, and I was always confused with the other ones, so that's the reason I'm always using Stephen H. Smith. I'll focus on the rich history of aviation in Springettsbury Township for this talk. I've lived in Springettsbury Township for 63 years. I was a manager of design engineering from York International when I retired. I continue to be a registered engineer in the state of Pennsylvania. And in retirement, I have focused on sharing my knowledge of local history via my York's Past blog and also public history talks. Now, acknowledging some of the sources I have listed here, I have photographs from the York County History Center, from the Library of Congress. Perhaps the best source for aviation in York County, the history of it, is Profile of Aviation of York County by John F.M. Wolfe. I hope to expand upon some of his things in his book and this presentation, some original research that I did. Newspapers.com is a good source. Ancestry.com also has good photographs, surprisingly attached to some of the people's things that they put on there. Springettsbury Township Historic Preservation Committee also has a nice group of pictures and other photos and documentation from my collections and things that are submitted to me from various talks also. Now, as far as coming attractions, this particular presentation, like I said, is the initial history night. The next history night will be held on Wednesday, October 13th, and will feature my presentation on the Codorus Navigation Works. In that presentation, you will learn about the operation and history of a system of 13 canal locks and dams along the Codorus Creek between York and the Susquehanna River, which allowed navigating 70-foot long canal boats, the whole length of that 11 miles, from downtown York to the Susquehanna River. And the township's connection to it is 9 of the 13 locks were within Springettsbury Township, what is now Springettsbury Township. So that will be my talk on the 13th. It may not be in this building because they're moving out of this building during construction in a month or two. So the new site will be on the website and it will be published in the media. So today's feature presentation is Aviation in Springettsbury. This 1931 photo in my title slide shows a regularly scheduled single-engine travel air airplane at the York Airport, then located along the west side of Haynes Road. A $16.20 flight left daily at 11 a.m. for a flight to Pittsburgh. It arrived 2 hours later. Beside the pilot, the plane held 5 passengers. There were weight limits on the luggage and the freight, depending upon the number and weight of the passengers. So you really had to plan that trip pretty good. This presentation focuses on aviation, primarily related to Springettsbury, although I deal a little bit of other areas, covering 40 years, from 1912 to 1952. So we'll start in 1912. You may wonder why 1912 in Springettsbury. Well, when this first plane flights occurred in the York area, an organization headquartered in Springettsbury was responsible for sponsoring those first flights. They sponsored this Curtiss airplane. Those flights originated from the York Fairgrounds on Labor Day weekend in 1912. The York Motor Company, then located on the corner of East Market Street and North Vernon Street in Springettsbury Township, sponsored those aviation exhibits. As a successful fundraiser, they had just purchased this building a couple months earlier, and they were looking for a fundraiser. And they had heard that Barney Oldfield had raced an airplane, and they thought that would be a good way to draw people to the fairgrounds. So that's basically what the event was, but they based a lot of other things around it. And focusing on this particular sign here, I'll zoom in on that. So that's the York Motor Club on East Market Street, and they basically promoted good roads. The members shared road trip travel ideas, and the club encouraged car ownership through gatherings and activities. The former Motor Club building still stands at 2025 East Market Street. Now, this is part of an August 31st, 1912 ad in the York Daily, one of the newspapers at that time, announcing a chance to see the first airplanes appearing in the York area. It notes, the aviation meet at the York Fairgrounds was under the auspices of the York Motor Club. The admission charged was 50 cents for adults and 25 cents for children. The two-day event attracted over 1,000 paying customers each day. However, many more waited outside the gates because the planes were in the air, so, so they got the show for free. But even so, the club was very pleased with the turnout, and they were able to pay off the first 2 years of their mortgage with this one event. Now, the pilot of the Curtiss single-seat airplane was Charles Hamilton. The plane itself was not flown there. At that time, at these exhibits, the planes are being shipped apart on railroad cars, and then the pilot had to assemble the plane before he flew it. So they had to be a good assembler and a good pilot at that time. So the first day of the event, he gave 6 demonstrations performing various feats of daring in the air. At the main attraction at the end of the day, it featured a 5-mile race between Charles Hamilton flying his 80 horsepower Curtiss biplane and John Menker driving a 60 horsepower Klein car. Now the Klein car was built in York at that time. Jimmy Klein actually modified one for racing, and it was introduced in June of 1912. It was quite successful. It actually won a couple of races on the East Coast. So they were racing this car against the airplane. The first day of the event, the airplane won the match race by 7 seconds. However, on the second day of the event, and this is a Library of Congress photo. It's not in York, but it's probably exactly what you saw in New York Fairgrounds that day. The second day of the event, the match race was decided in favor of the automobile, in which the Klein car, driven by John Menker, established a new record for the half-mile track at the York Fairgrounds by covering 10 laps, which is 5 miles, in 6 minutes and 25 seconds, averaging 47 miles per hour. So that was probably a neat event to see. The only other flights that appeared in York County before World War I were a couple exhibitions. And in 1914, one such venture was sponsored by the York Railway Company, which is a trolley line. They built a temporary flying field at Hilton along the Dover trolley lines to attract weekend trolley passengers out into the country. The airfield was created in 1 week by cutting the grass and building a small hangar, which was the requirement of the people that they contracted to bring in. They contracted with a company for the appearance of a Wright brothers passenger-carrying airplane. And when I say passenger-carrying, it's hard to see on this particular photo, but there's actually a passenger in the middle, an engine on the side, and the pilot on the other wing. So I have an empty airplane here to show you what it looked like. So Like essentially the passenger sits here, right next to the engine, and the pilot's over here. So this is the first piloted passenger airplane here. And actually the United States military, this is the first airplane they purchased because they discovered they could have a soldier sitting on this seat with a few bombs in his lap, and he could drop them pretty accurately. So the United States Air Force Museum actually has this plane in their exhibit as the first plane ever in their Air Force. So this is the plane that was in Dover at that particular time. It cost, for an 8-minute ride, it cost $25 for the flight. And there were quite a few takers. This temporary Hilton field along the Dover trolley line was not very successful. They were only able to attract one other set of weekends. Otherwise, it closed in a matter of months. Now, other than the contracted demonstration flights, York County had very little exposure to seeing airplanes flying overhead until 1917, when the United States entered World War I. And that was due to two military airfields established in the general area. At Middletown Airfield, that opened in 1917 on turf field along the Susquehanna River in Dauphin County, and was primarily established as a supply depot and maintenance center for the military aircraft at that time. It became Olmsted Air Force Base until inactivated and redeveloped as Harrisburg International Airport. The first permanent airfield in Washington, D.C. area also opened in 1917. It was the flying field at Anacosta. This turf field was located along the Potomac River in southeast Washington. The site quickly evolved into two separate facilities, Balling Field for the Army Air Corps and the Naval Air Station at Anacosta. Now, the importance of these airfields basically resulted in the first permanent airfield in York County, actually located in Springettsbury Township, which was a military airfield. So I'll get into that just a little bit later. Now, during World War I, York County saw the greatest number of flyovers during 1918, after they had quite more. At the beginning of the war, they only had 60 pilots total in the United States in the military. By the end of the war, they had 10,000. So, and most of that training existed in later 1917, early 1918. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough planes to go around to all the pilots. So only about 1 out of 10 pilots actually saw action overseas. Maybe get some more chairs for these people if you can. Now the Curtiss, however, the Curtiss Jennies, when they flew over the head in 1918, many times sometimes they had unplanned landings in fields, but on other occasions they were planned occasions where they landed. Those airplanes were part of government war bond drives. Arriving in the area, they would drop leaflets from the airplanes to attract greater attention to the Liberty Loan rallies near the landing sites. Several of those landings were in fields of Springettsbury Township. Shown as part of a leaflet dropped from into York County during 1918 from a squad of Curtiss Jennies from the 48th Squadron stationed in Mitchell Field in Long Island, New York. After the war ended, victory bond drives were still utilized to help pay for World War I. three Curtis Jenneys from the Middletown Airfield made a scheduled visit to York County on April 29, 1919. They utilized a favorite landing site, the farm field of Joe Kindick Sr. in Springettsbury Township, which basically evolved into the Fayfield area airfield. The aviators were authorized to take anybody that purchased $10,000 worth of victory bonds for a ride in a military airplane. There were several takers, even including Carlton Hoff, who offered the airplane ride to his wife, which she accepted. Now, Carl Ort was a Yorker that learned to fly in the Army Air Corps during World War I. After the war, as a private pilot, he basically was involved in several businesses, aviation-related businesses in Springettsbury Township. There would be no permanent airfield in York County until 1925. However, in 1921, Dauphin County already had the military airfield at Middletown and a private flying field in Harrisburg. On May 22, 1921, Carl Ort, pilot, and Dan Dance, mechanic, became the new proprietors of Dauphin Flying Field. It was located at 24th and Derry Streets in Harrisburg. Carl quickly became known for his daring acrobatics. Because of that, they always announced in these ads for airplane rides, safe and sane airplane rides. He didn't, and essentially it was $10 to fly from Harrisburg to Hershey at that particular time. So here's Carl Ort standing next to his de Havilland 6 airplane, commonly known as DH-6. This particular photo may have been taken in Dawson Flying Field or on a field east of York, because Carl Ort commuted to work in Harrisburg from his home on West King Street in York. He utilized the trolley between his home and a field in East York, where he parked the airplane overnight, from which he flew to and from Dauphin Flying Field each day. Ort's personal landing field east of York became a de facto flying field before any permanent fields existed. Ort's personal landing field had a few possibilities. However, coming up with some photo analysis, Carl Ort's flying field strongly favors one location. Now, showing a little bit what little Carl Ort did, Carl Ort often went into performances at county fairs, carnivals, and other events for 2 years, from 1921 to 1922. Claude Martin was his partner, who wing walked, did tricks while hanging from the flying gear, and jumped out of the airplane with parachutes. These are photos from Carl Ort's collection at the History Center. Another thing Carl did is he began aerial advertising. He was one of the first ones to do that. He started that in the spring of 1923, and it took much of his attention well into 1924. Carl pioneered a unique style of aerial advertising when he was contracted with John F. Rickert to utilize an airplane to advertise the Havana Cadet brand of cigar produced by Rickert's Manchester Cigar Company, which wasn't located in Manchester. It's actually located in York. That's just the name of the company. And Ray Paris was his sales manager. So what Carl did is, on the bottom of his plane, he had advertising messages, and he would fly low over the areas, which you couldn't do today. So he flew low so people would look up and see the messages. He also dropped smoke bombs if you had to fly higher to get their attention. After he had their attention, he would drop leaflets with messages. And some of those leaflets, he also occasionally would tie small parachutes to sample cigars that would drop out of the plane. So he was advertising for quite a while. And after his first extensive advertising tour, lasting 6 weeks, in the fall of 1923, he had several photographs of his airplane taken for promotional use and later advertising. And this was at the temporary landing field east of York. I'll show you why this site is on the south side of the 1900 block of East Market Street in Springettsbury Township. A small portion of the Rockburn Street heading north off Market is seen at the extreme right side. So this is actually Rockburn Street here. So the south side of Market Street at that particular location had very few houses at this time, if any. And I'll show you why this is. If you look at the next photo, this is 1911 East Market Street and 1901 East Market Street. Now, they are of an extremely unique design. The 1901 is a Second Empire style architecture. Records show it was built in 1857. The 1911 East Market Street lot was purchased in September of 1922, and Judge Sergeant Ross had it built during 1923, and he occupied it in Christmas in 1923. And if you look at the photo, you see it looks like it's, the yard isn't finished yet, so this is probably nearing completion. So that's kind of a match there. But we have better matches coming up. If you look up the street, you have this eastward-looking photo with houses at 2001 2001 and 2025 East Market Street in the background. Here is the now photo of the view looking east. The 2025 East Market Street building has the distinctive colonial revival architecture. It was the site of the York Motor Club. So you see the site of the York Motor Club there. The 2001 East Market Street building was on a lot purchased by Murray Ream during April of 1923, with the house built and occupied in April of 1924. So you look at this photo, and again, this is a view at the same place looking east. Again, you have matches. And again, the building that doesn't have the roof on, 2001, is in that time frame when it's being constructed. So this is along the south side of the 1900 block of East Market Street. Carl Ort's temporary landing field for a couple years. I even need better photos, but we'll go to that. So the Manchester Cigar Company, it has the proprietor, has a sales manager, and Carl Ort, the pilot. So we'll look here at that's Carl Ort in his advertising photograph. The other one is Ray Paris. He was a sales manager for the Manchester Cigar Company. Now, Ray rode along during selected tours with Carl. The reason, every place the airplane landed, the gathered crowd presented the perfect platform to Ray to hand out samples, but more importantly, cultivate additional dealers for the Manchester Cigar Company. Now, if you look at this photo from a higher vantage point, you can actually see the York Motor Club building better in this one. But essentially, why do you have all that advertising on the top of it? You can't see it from the ground. But the thing is, why so much on the top? Airplanes were still a novelty in the 1920s. Crowds often gathered wherever airplanes landed, especially airplanes that had dropped cigars, set off bombs, and dropped leaflets from the sky. Now, wouldn't you congregate to that? What's going on here? Now, another proof that this was a landing field, in one of the photos, you see this roller up here? On a turf landing field, you cut the grass and you roll the ground. That's two requirements for a turf landing field. I know that because my brother managed one for a year after he was out of college. So I was up there a couple times at Center Air Park in Center County. But essentially, so the south side of East Market Street was considered almost a de facto first flying field in Springettsbury Township and in York County, maybe. This is the route that Carl took on his first excursion. He actually flew over all the states east of the Mississippi several times, except for Maine, because he needed an emergency landing site and there's too many trees up there, and he couldn't find any good landing sites in Maine. So he wanted to get Maine, but he didn't. Now, the next landing field is essentially the first permanent airfield, considered the first permanent airfield in York County. Again, located in Springettsbury Township. And this is the military airfield, which opened 5 years earlier than the airfield where Fayfield is. These headlines from July 16, 1925 issue of the Gazette and Daily provided Yorkers with the initial insight by announcing officers of Air Station, meaning Middletown Army Airfield in the text, accept landing site, with the subheading, land offered by Speedway Project declared to be suitable. Now, the Speedway Project was something not often talked about here in York County, but the records are in the newspapers, and I found information on other sources that kind of back it up. The Speedway Project noted in the news article was the construction of a board speedway in Springettsbury Township, slightly larger than the one shown in this photo, where the view is from the start-finish line towards turn 4 of the 1 1/8 mile board speedway that opened in Laurel, Maryland during June 11, 1925, the same time that one was being planned in York County. The foreground shows the wood structure to create the speedway. So the wood structure down here, these are all wood. Even the track is wood. So, and it went from banking like 5 degrees in the front straights to 40 degrees banking in the turns. So these are like modern NASCAR super speedways. But they didn't last long because of the maintenance of the wood. So 2 months earlier, these headlines from May 9th of 1925 issue of the York Dispatch provide Yorkers with the initial insight about the 1 1/4 mile high bank board speedway to be named the Great Lincoln Speedway and to be constructed for $500,000 in Springettsbury Township with the subheading, will conclude negotiations for third of adjoining farms on Monday. So what are these 3 adjoining farms? They actually named the owners of them in this article, so that made it easy to track it down. I use this J. David Allen photo of July 2nd, 1955 to point out the 3 adjoining farms, which were either purchased outright or the rights were acquired to construct the Great Lincoln Speedway. In the photo, the view looks west from the Stony Brook area, which is down here. This is the Stony Brook area. Here's Pleasant Acres, and it looks up toward Mount Zion Road is up here. So putting the labels on, there's the labels. And the 3 farms that were involved in this are shown here. Now, the boundaries of the 3 farms is important because the Lincoln Realty and Amusement Company, the developers of the Great Lincoln Speedway, offered the infield of the Speedway to the Army to create an Army airfield for the Middletown Army Airfield. And it was basically an emergency landing site that they needed. And Farm 1 was the farm here. So Farm 1 at that time was owned by John W. Hartley. Farm 2 was previously owned by Frederick Strickler, and in 1925, at this particular time, it was by his widow, Amanda Strickler, and her sister-in-law, Mary Strickler. So the Strickler farmhouse is actually right here. Okay, so continuing on here, so the Strickler farmhouse is located, like I said, up in this area. The third farm, Farm 3, off to the side, was a farm in the estate of John Hauser. The York Daily Record or the Gazette and Daily from July 29, 1925 issue reported on yesterday's, that is July 28th, ceremonies opening the permanent airfield in York County, built on land provided by the Speedway developers. It was an emergency landing turf field, primarily for military aircraft flying between Middletown and Washington, D.C. It could also be used for airmail when that service was initiated and had the potential of being leased. A squadron of airplanes flew in from Middletown as part of the opening ceremonies in front of a gathering of 500 residents. In only 2 weeks, the turf landing field was prepared, wing gauges and other support equipment installed. The quick acceptance and establishment of a landing field within the infield of the yet-to-be-built Great Lincoln Speedway coincided with a need for a few more permanent emergency landing fields along the Washington, D.C. to Middletown flying route. The urgency involved map publication deadlines because the first of a proposed series of every 5 years air navigation maps was about ready to be put to press. So essentially, this is the reason why the rush was to finish this particular landing field. Now, I was able to finally track down a copy of that 1925 map. Actually, a professor up at Penn State in the map room, he said, check with the University of Connecticut. They have a good collection. So I checked with them, and they agreed to supply me a copy on a USB drive, which they mailed down for a nominal fee. So this is from the 1925 air navigation map. And it was considered an experimental map because they are experimenting with air maps now. But on this map, you basically had 2 symbols. One symbol, this particular one here, represents, I call it like a pie-shaped slice in 8 pieces. That's a government, Army, Navy, or Marine landing field. The plus is emergency or unimproved landing field. Now, what they did on these is that, I'll show a section here. Now, this is the Middletown to York section of that complete map. On that, the dashed line that drops down from the Middletown airfield is the direct path to the Washington airfield. So that gives you bearings to the Washington airfield. The only other airfield shown on this is this plus here. So I'll zoom into that. So they position these airfields very precisely in regard to the railroads and the roads and the towns. At that time, IFR navigation was I follow roads or I follow railroads. So that was the navigation back then. That particular airfield, that Lieutenant LeBreau of the Middletown airfield actually went to the airfield right after it opened and made precise measurements. So they got the precise measurement as far as where this plus would be placed in relationship to the roads, the railroads in the town. So it shows that this plus is east of where the railroad crosses the main road, which is the Lincoln Highway. So it's west of that, and it's north of both the railroad and the Lincoln Highway, which is exactly where I was showing you before on the property maps. So you have good correspondence there. So we know the Army, or the Stony Brook Army Airfield was at that location. And you can actually, I was working with a guy that's really expertise in the board tracks, and we positioned where that field would be located. And it basically stretches from, here's the prison, and there's Pleasant Acres. So in the field between those two, if they would have completed it and didn't run into financial problems, that's where you would have had a board track. Now, unfortunately, all the board tracks either only lasted like 2 to 3 years before the nails started coming up, the splinters coming up, and it's just, you couldn't maintain them. The longest board track in the United States actually lasted in Altoona. They had one that lasted 7 years. But back then, you had the auto racing championships were determined, pretty much 3/4 of the races in the 1920s were on board tracks. You had the race at Indianapolis on the bricks, but most of the other ones you were on wood. So, but essentially, like I said, at the end of the 1920s, pretty much all of them went away. Now, Carl Ort starts his first business in Springettsbury Township, besides his temporary airfield. And that's because he gets back into the aerial photography business. And in the aircraft, they started an aircraft yearbook in which they started to describe or list all the pilots involved in commercial operations. Now, Carl Ort had a listing there, and he lists Carl Ort, 2 planes, leases field, 600 flights, 50,000 miles, 30 passengers, aerial photography. Now, the 600 flights is because of all his aerial advertising work, and the 50,000 miles, again, all his aerial advertising work. The 30 passengers would be in your current endeavor. So he flew very few passengers. And he's basically in business, those were his photographers that were in the plane. But the thing is, he was actually leasing the Stony Brook Army Airfield. So at that particular time, he was leasing the Stony Brook Army Airfield. He was probably the first one to lease that. And he was in business in that area from 1926 through 1928, which actually corresponds to the time he was working with Malin Haynes. I got that coming up. I got ahead of myself there. But, and I say I got ahead of myself because in that photo from 1955, there's an area here that in the corner of Farm 1 that looks like these might be hangars. In the 1937 aerial photo, there's actually 3 hangars. It looks like 3 hangars there. It looks like one is gone in 55. But these have arrows on them, which might point the direction you have to land or something like that. I'm not a pilot, so I don't know, but it might be something like that. But on that particular site, there's a 100-unit assisted living, or I forget what they call it. It's a 100-unit house on that, or business on that. I got the name here someplace. Where's it at? Oh, Stony Brook Manor is there, and they've been there since the 1960s, a 100-unit public housing unit in that site. So we can't look at that site anymore and investigate that. But one thing that was done, this is an aerial, westward-looking John David Allen aerial photo of Malin Haynes' Yorkshire Ranch. The photo is actually in the 1940s. But from October of 1928, or from November of 1925 through October of 1928, Malin Haynes kept buffaloes on his ranch, enclosed in a pasture within the the 318-acre Yorkshire Ranch, located about 2 miles from the Stony Brook Army Airfield. It was discovered that the buffaloes weren't eating very good, and that one day when Carl Ort was flying over, the buffaloes ran around and they ate. So Carl Ort got a job every Sunday at 3 o'clock. Crowds would gather, and Carl Ort would come and fly over the buffaloes, get them some exercise, and then they'd be on their feet again for another week. So, and this was actually picked up in newspapers, not only around the United States, but I found newspaper articles in other countries about this. So Springettsbury made the big news here with Carl Ort, Malin Haynes, and buffaloes. So now the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania began to issue pilot licenses in 1928. Carl Ort was quite proud of the fact that he managed to be one of the first 12 licensed pilots in Pennsylvania. That is Carl before he had his beard. If anybody knew Carl Ort, he had a big beard toward the end. Now, on June 30th, 1930, a Goodyear blimp named Mayflower, which made its maiden flight only a few months earlier, landed at a Springettsbury Township farm. The free attraction was sponsored by the York Flying Service Incorporated. That was a group of 5 York individuals who were leasing 40 acres of the same farm from Joe Kindick Sr. To provide flying instruction and to offer airplane rides to passengers for a penny a pound. The event was well attended by local residents, among them members of the York Chamber of Commerce. The York Flying Service had been incorporated in April of 1930 and had created a successful business. However, on August 18th of 1930, the York Chamber of Commerce, via the creation of the York Airport Company, Incorporated, bought the 40 acres that the York Flying Service was leasing, plus most of the remainder of Joe Kindick Sr.'s farm. On those total of 157 acres, the first commercial York airport was established, with regularly scheduled passenger flights. So the first commercial York airport operated from 1930 to 1937. It is also traditionally called the Fayfield Airport because the Fayfield development would spring up in that area, but that would be later. At that time, if one traveled south on Haynes Road and looked off to your right between present 7th and 9th Avenues, one would see these pictured airport buildings as shown on this detailed scale model. Now, the scale model is in the collections of the Agricultural and Industrial Museum of the York County History Center. So you would see this, and essentially you had this building here, which was the administration building. That housed offices of the York Airport Company, offices of the initial airport operator, which was Pittsburgh Airways. It had a passenger waiting area, it had a ticket counter, and it had a restaurant. Now, scheduled passenger service commenced at the York Airport on October 15th, 1930. The official dedication occurred a week later. From that airport, flights to Philadelphia and to New York left daily at 4 o'clock, with a 55-minute flight to Philadelphia costing $8 and a 45-minute flight to New York costing $14.40. A flight for Pittsburgh left daily at 11 o'clock in the morning. It cost $16.20 for the 2-hour flight. So these were regularly scheduled. You basically could show up that day, get a ticket, wait for almost like you do today. Now the big building in the back was the airport hangar. Now the airport hangar, this is a view of it. It basically has Pittsburgh Airways up here, York Airport, but it's an Atlantic Airways plane. That's because Pittsburgh Airways went bankrupt in a matter of a year and a half. Atlantic Airways, they followed. They also went bankrupt fast. The Great Depression wasn't great for passenger airlines. So after those particular airlines went bankrupt, the local York Flying Service leased the airport and ran it until 1937, when developers wanted the land for development. Now the hangar itself was a big unit. It's like a 120-foot wide front door on the west side, 80 feet deep. When the airport ceased operation in 1937, after the airport closed, the hangar was disassembled and repurposed as a hangar at Piper Aircraft Airport in Lock Haven. The concrete floor of the hangar was broken up, and pieces of it can still occasionally be found when residents in that area dig in the ground. Sometimes they claim it's part of the runway, but these were all turf runways at that time. You didn't have a permanent runway in the area until the 1950s. They were all grass at that time. This particular aerial photo I've mapped out in yellow, which was the extent of where the airfield was. And this particular area down here, that is where the office building is between there's 7th Avenue and 9th Avenue. So this is on the corner of 7th Avenue and Haynes Road. This is where the hangar was. That's already been removed by the time of this photo, which is dated, this is a dated photo from March 19th, 1938. So that hangar is already gone. But the yellow area shows the extent of the flying field. And if you've ever lived between Russell Street and Royal Street, the airfield basically ran up between them. That was the main runway. You can almost faintly see it here, but it's hard to see. But a couple of residents told me that's where the runway was. They also had one going across, but they rarely used that because that was much shorter. So what happened to the airfield? Again, developers decided the land was too valuable, plus the landing field was getting very small for the sizes of planes that were coming out. So essentially they basically sold it to a developer. The initial auction was for the 50 lots along Haynes Road. And this is actually probably the first site where you see the road name change from Airport Road to Haynes Road. This is the very first where the fronting on Haynes Road. So Haynes got involved and said, name the road after me. And they said, give us some money and we'll do it. He probably did. So this is what the development looks like. This is an eastward view. This is a 1949 bird's eye view that was in the Gazette and Daily that I added the road names. So at that particular time, the development had been started 2 years earlier. They reported that 173 of the 450 building lots were sold and 34 houses were built at that particular time. Now this particular building up here, that's the old administration building. During the 30s and 40s, after the airport closed, that was a state police building that they gave driver's license tests at. But in the 1940s, it was actually converted to a house, and that house still stands there. The views you always see are of the back of it. You cannot tell that was the administration building now, but the core of it is there. Another neat story of Springettsbury is that of Gigi Nagle. He opened the Highway Bridge service station in 1928. His was not your usual service station on the Lincoln Highway. Nagle's business card from 1935 notes, he not only provided gasoline and oil for your automobile, he also had tourist cabins, a lunchroom, did machine designing, sold radios, and was a sales and service dealer for Tyler Club airplanes. Not your usual service station. Sold and serviced airplanes. Nagel had purchased his Tyler Club airplane in 1932 and 2 years later became a Tyler Club aircraft dealer. Like I said, not your usual service station. He rarely went by his first name. There it is, G-I-R-A-R-D-U-S. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. People probably messed it up all the time, so he never used it. Now, from over Stony Brook, which is this is Locust Grove Road, Stony Brook here. Here I've annotated it so you can see it better. That was a calendar that Gigi Nagle put out for Christmas of 1935. So that is a good way to. So he basically took this photo in 1935 for his 1936 or from his Christmas 1935 calendar, he took it in 1935. That basically shows the area over Stony Brook, which is down here. This is Locust Grove Road, goes back through here. You have the Lincoln Highway coming up this way, and here's where the Lincoln Highway bridges the railroad, and the railroad goes this way to Wrightsville. Again, you're looking to the east. Gigi Nagle's, he built his business in 1928, which is the same year that the highway bridge opened. So that was in existence from 1928 to 1998. One thing that Gigi Nagle did, he gave free airplane rides if you purchased $15 worth of any kind of business with him. He got a lot of takers for this. Some people refused to fly with him in his plane, but he got a lot of takers. And essentially, in the calendar that he put out for a 1936 gift for his customers, he put out this calendar, and I'll go over sections of it quickly. And it says, "This remembrance is dedicated to my many friends, and especially those listed herein, for their confidence and privilege of having personally given them their first airplane ride experience." So on the top of it, surrounding this, has the names of 203 people that he gave the first airplane ride. And actually, if you go to my blog site, and I can tell you later how to get to it, but I have all those listed in there if you want to check them out. But here he is standing next to his airplane. Gigi Nagle, he was quite a guy. It's like he came to York from the coal region of eastern Pennsylvania. He worked at Pullman Automobile Works as a motor mechanic for 5 years, after which he became a machinist at American Chain and Cable, where he became very astute at inventing things. Then in 1928, he struck out on his own with his Do Everything service station, which he owned and operated for 10 years before he leased out the service station and the lunchroom to our newcomer, which they continued to sell Richfield gasoline products. Nagle maintained the machine shop and the hangar on the site, which were separate buildings. He developed several innovations involving auto racing, and in the 1940 census, he listed his occupation as an engineer. During World War II, he did subcontract machine work in his machine shop, supporting the York plan. Now, his airplane is actually in a museum in Virginia. This is the E-2 Tyler Club airplane originally owned by Gigi Nagle, in which many local residents had their first airplane rides in the 1930s. It was restored and is exhibited in the Virginia Aviation Museum at the Richmond International Airport. It is considered rare and museum-worthy because it is one of the earliest survivors of a design that evolved into the famous Piper Cub airplane. Now, many of Nagle's service station buildings still stand at 3852 East Market Street. They look kind of nondescript now. The previous thing that made it prevalent was this was the home of Mom's Diner. And that photo is at the top, that's 25 years ago. It's actually the fifth incarnation of that diner, which began by Nagle and went through, it was Nagle's Diner, then it was Newcomer's Diner, then it was Myers Diner, then it was Daisy's Diner, before it was Mom's Diner. Now, I say Mom's is plural because it's named after two moms that owned it. It was Deb Weber and Wanda Christensen were the owners, so they named it Mom's. So those buildings still stand, and the bottom view is a now view in another direction, and the Myers family still owns it. Now, the final airport is Valley Airways Airport. Now, this is a view looking north. I give a then and now comparison. The then 1947 and the now. 1947 is on the top, and the now is on the bottom. And running across it, you basically have East Market Street running across there. Again, East Market Street running across here on the bottom. So this is the area, you're looking north where the York Mall was built. So in 1947, you have Valley Airways. You have a private hangar out here, which still stands along Northern Way. The airplane hangar buildings are there. You see the York Valley Inn over to this side, which is just about where the entrance is to Walmart. Between the entrance road and M&T Bank, that's about where the old York Valley Inn was located, which you have a picture back here painted by a doctor in the area. Dr. McHenry painted that one. Essentially, the hangars were located between what is now Pandier Bread and Walmart, and in the lower area, if you want to see where Playland is, Playland was located right about between where Wendy's and Arby's is. You had Burry's Hamburgers at that time. Now we have Wendy's and Arby's. So that's a then and now to give you an idea of where Valley Airways Airport was located. Now, Valley Airways was the name of the company, Valley Airways Incorporated. And they operated as Valley Air Park, but they also were under the Valley Airways Airport also. And they sold a number of planes, but this airport was known as a training center for pilots. They trained close to, they trained close to 400 pilots at that particular airfield in a number of years. Because the GI Bill of veterans coming back from World War II, they were able to pay for those lessons through the GI Bill. So that's the reason you got a number of pilots trained there. These are a series of J. David Allen aerial photos that provide views of the airport. This particular one is an eastward looking view. This is Market Street or the Lincoln Highway. You see the York Valley Inn here. These are the hangars, and I can pan off to the other side and you look at the airfields. You had 3 runways that ran diagonally, some this way and one this way. So you had the 3 runways, and they were much longer than the ones at Fayfield. You can actually land bigger planes here. You actually had a DC-3 that landed here a couple times. So you had bigger planes. And this particular view, you can see like they have 18 planes parked along here or tied down. At one time, there were 75 planes stationed here at this airport. So this is a big airport. You can see this particular, which became Valley Canvas, and it was recently Office Works Today, and it's now Stellar Fitness. The only building that remains, and the reason it remains is that the brother of the owner of the field that owned the field has actually built that. And he had a business in New York, a contractor business, hardware business, various things. And he's the one that actually started Valley Canvas there after the airport closed down. So that's a close-up of that one. This is a view, another view, again, a lower view. You can see Playland there. You can see Market Street here, York Valley Inn. You get an idea of the buildings there, the hangars. Again, a closer view. Say, J. David Allen liked to take pictures of that airport because I guess he flew out of it a lot with his father as a pilot. Now, the last item here is I got some things. The Santa is actually, the thing of Santa arriving by airplane and going to the Bonton was initiated at Valley Airways Airport in 1946. They would arrive there by plane. They would actually leave the Lancaster Airport, fly here, and Santa would get out the plane, see all the kids, and then there'd be a parade to downtown York, and Santa would climb the ladder and get up in the Bonton so he could visit him. So it was initiated here in 1946, and they flew into this airport from 1946 into 1952. And at that time, the name had changed already to, let's see, was it? The name had changed to York Whitehall Airport in 1949 when Valley Airways Airport went bankrupt. All these companies going bankrupt. The Whitehall comes from the partnership between the duo of George Whiteley III and Earl Hall, who had leased the facility under the name of York Continental Airways. They offered aircraft sales, service, and charter flights. Now, I use this wider view of Santa's arrival to point out the private hangar again that still stands. In December of 1952, the York Whitehall Airport closed. The airport at that site had been leased on leased land of 94 acres from Henry Frank, the owner of the land. The lease was not renewed in 1953 because the Pennsylvania Railroad was interested in acquiring the land for a future rail transfer freight yard. The lease, and essentially that's why they terminated the lease. The purchase was actually executed by the Pennsylvania Railroad on April 1st of 1953. All of the land, except for the lone lot with the private hangar, was sold to the Pennsylvania Railroad. However, the need for a future rail transfer yard quickly was negated because of huge growth in long-distance trucking, which was primarily due to the rapid construction of the interstate highway system. So you can count on the interstate highway system for not having this as a rail yard in this area. The eastern part of the former airport property was sold by the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1962 to McCroy's as a regional headquarters, and they also built a 17-acre distribution center, which still stands on that property. Then in 1965, the western part of the airport property was sold by the railroad to allow development of the York Mall, now primarily anchored by Walmart Supercenter. And so, the Pennsylvania Railroad had a hand in driving the last airfield out of Springettsbury Township. And that marks the end of a significant chapter in our township history. So, if you have any questions, I want to give Dave a chance to give his presentation first, and then I'll answer the questions. Okay, Dave?
Okay.
Yep. I'll keep the pictures up of the aerial photos.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Wasn't that great?
Thank you.
Very impressive. My talk is going to be short, and it's going to be more about fun. Okay. Dad got the bug when a barnstormer stopped at his father's farm in Brook Valley when he was a kid. And his father gave the $5 to the barnstormer and let him take a ride. And that's all I think any young child would need to move forward in an aviation career. So he started lessons while he was still in high school. And those lessons would have been at the area now known as Airfield. And a lot of people didn't know this, but back then, if you were 14, you could get up alone and go and get your lessons. So he started to fly a Waco, which is a twin-wing, single-engine plane. And he was very proficient at it. And then the war came along, and he wasn't drafted, actually he volunteered and went into the Army, ended up in the Army Corps of Engineers in the South Pacific. And his group was in charge of taking out jungle and creating landing strips. So even in the Army, he's still around airplane things. Dad told me so many things about cutting in airstrips in Jap-held islands that we could talk for an hour just on that, but we're not here to talk about that. So when he got done, just as this gentleman said, the GI Bill afforded him some things that he probably would not have been able to attain on his own. He did buy an airplane. He bought a Piper Cub. And that Piper Cub he kept. I think it was kept on the family farm in the barn, but I'm not sure. And then when he really got the bug, he started at Valley, and this is one of your pilots that was trained. And he went to twin engine, commercial, and instrument rating. Now here's some of the interesting parts. One Sunday afternoon, he always flew with a bunch of guys. They were all, they were all into aviation. They all had these little planes and they flew. That was what they did on the weekend. So one Sunday they decide that they're gonna try to just use dead reckoning and coordinates where you have to follow the trail left by the front plane, which happened to be Dad's plane. So it's kind of like tag in airplanes. And so Dad said he went down, he flew down towards the Wizard Ranch. Down, you're going down to, Accomack. I couldn't remember the name of the restaurant. And the way he would mark a clue as to where you're going to turn to your next coordinate was they would take a 5-pound paper sack of flour and they would drop it from 1,000 or 2,000 feet. And when it hit the intersection, it just, everywhere. And here's this immense white spot. Well, the guy that owned the little house that was sitting there he heard all the planes and he thought, hey, you know, everybody wants to see planes back then. He goes out and he stands in the intersection as they had already dropped the bag of flour. It didn't hit the man, but Dad said when that thing hit, he just turned into a ghost. Screaming and shaking his hands at him. He said, we just didn't even care about that coordinate. So I always thought that was a very funny story. And then one time they decided they were going to take off on a Saturday afternoon, and they flew, as soon as they got in the air, because they were flying VFR, Visual Flight Rules. This was before you got his rating. They were flying VFR, and they were heading out towards West York, well, actually North York. And dead ahead, there's a storm, and this storm must have been rolling towards them so quickly they could not calculate the speed. So they were out past the Susquehanna Trail, probably near, what would be near? I don't know any landmarks out there. Well, near the Outdoor Country Club in that area. And that storm was so close, they just all turned around and it started to pour. So now you're doing VFR. The only thing you can rely on is your altimeter to make sure you're up. And they thought, we'll get back, we'll get back. Because the storm was such a fast mover, it was going to come over top of them. Well, at that time, there was a radio station, WSBA 910 AM, that had 4 towers out there on the Susquehanna Trail. I see a lot of heads now. Okay. Well, Dad was trying to keep it low to monitor the highways he's crossing over as landmarks because you can't see anything dead ahead. And all of a sudden, rip, the very top of the light cut open the bottom of the fabric on the Cub. That's how close he was. And if he was any lower, it probably would have grabbed something and just flipped him right down. But he said, I was never so scared as the time when I was that low and scraped the top of that tower. You know, he felt someone was really watching over him. So he met a man, and the man was from York originally, okay? And so this man went to college and he got started with a corporation in Pittsburgh called Pittsburgh Plate Glass, PPG. Now PPG, of course, now is an immense corporation worldwide. But at the time, this man, and his name was Leo Feldman, this man was wealthy enough to fly a plane, and it was a twin-engine Beech. It was, from what I saw a picture one time, gorgeous airplane, gorgeous. He worked a deal with my father that if you get your instrument rating and your twin commercial, you can use my plane anytime you want, but then you become my pilot. So he said, okay, who wouldn't? And so out of the Valley Airport, Dad became the instrument-rated pilot. And he flew Mr. Feldman all over the place. Now this coincides with something else that we learned about today, and you heard him say it a number of times, J. David Allen photography. Well, Dad knew Dave because Dave would come to the airport to try to go up and take aerial photography, and he would take the first pilot that came in that was available. And you saw many, many, many of his pictures. In fact, years later, when I was just a kid, J. David Allen was 2 blocks down from our house, so I knew all the Allen kids, they knew all of us. And this is a really weird coincidence. but J. David Allen's wife, Betty, was my wife's aunt. Yeah, can you believe that? I had no idea. I delivered their paper, but that I didn't know my wife was related to them. And so years later, that came out. Hey, you must know my aunt because she lives in your neighborhood. Yes, I did. But anyway, Dad would fly David out. Dave, he went by Dave. And Dave, when he flew, the optics weren't so hot back then with trying to shoot through glass. They took the doors off. Now, to me, there's something about being in a twin beach that could do 225 to 250 miles an hour cruise speed, and the doors are off, and you're kind of hanging out, you know, oh no, Bob, go a little bit to the left or the right, you know. Whatever, you know, he went out a lot with Dave, and they really never had any problems. I do know, though, that when he flew Mr. Feldman to Baltimore one afternoon, the very same thing that happened to him out in North York happened on the way to Baltimore. It got fogged in. There was very little weather activity back then that you could pre-plan. It was all like, look at the sky. Well, it looks okay. And you could, if you had a radio that was strong enough to call down to Baltimore, or you could get a phone to call down to Baltimore, you could figure out roughly what's going to happen with the weather. So they flew down there, and along 695. Yeah, along 695. Here we go again. There's 3 towers. One of the towers is still there. It's the WBAL. Television and radio towers. Now it's all microwave, there's only 1 tower left. And it got so foggy, even with the instruments, that they were really having some serious issues, because even with instruments, when you're in complete fog, you don't know if you're up, down, sideways, upside down. It's a real problem. And so they were going to do their best to land at Friendship Airport at the time. And so they started to drop down, and I guess they dropped down too soon. Now that tower was 3 times as high as what it was out in North York. And sure as heck, his wing clipped the top light because he couldn't see. Minor damage, because that's an aluminum airplane. And they safely landed without any problems. And so then finally Mr. Feldman retires, and he says, he said to my dad, well, you know, I think I'm going to sell the plane, and I'm going to retire to Florida. And he goes, anytime you're down there, you are welcome in my house. So Dad couldn't afford the beach, and by then, people like me came along. There were 6 of us, and so he went to work a steady job in the paper industry. He worked for 40 years at Standard Register down the road here. I don't think it's that anymore. I don't know what it's called, but it used to be Standard Register. And when I was 1964. I was 9 in 1964. And so Dad packs us all in the car. We're going to Florida. And pretty much the first stop was at Leo Feldman's house. And no one had any idea what we were going to go into. Well, at the time, Fort Lauderdale was like Boca Raton is now, and West Palm Beach. Fort Lauderdale was the place to live. And Mr. Feldman had this absolutely gorgeous home sitting on the causeway. And I still remember this home like it was last night. So Dad knocks on the door, and the maid answers. And I had never seen a maid in my life. And she was also the cook. And she welcomed us in, and Mom wouldn't let us move forward from the vestibule or the foyer of the house because the carpet was pure white. And we were kids. So Mr. Feldman comes out and he greets Mom and Dad. And then we just stood there, you know. And finally he says, "What are you guys doing out there? Come on in." And he goes, "You want some ice cream?" So, sure, you know. And here's another shock I never had experienced, and that was the maid comes up. She goes, "What kind of ice cream would you like?" And she rattled off 9, 10 flavors, and we're just dying. This is perfect. Beautiful air-conditioned home, pool, the whole bit. So finally, he said, to Dad, "Mom, I got rid of the plane, and I bought a boat. And I love boats." And he said, "Oh, that's great, that's great. Where do you keep it?" He goes, "It's right out in the backyard," because it was on the causeway. So I'm thinking, boat, you know, with a real small motor, the whole bit. We get out there, here's this 47-foot cabin cruiser. I mean, I just wanted to stay and live there. I would be his whatever I could be. And so we had a really good time. It was a memory I had just because my dad learned to fly and flew out of Springettsbury Township in York County. And there were good times. So that's all I have to say. It's nothing fancy. It's not historic, but we thought maybe you'd enjoy it. If you have any questions.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your dad's name?
Oh, yes. Yeah, Robert Heltzel, Heltzel. And there's not many of us in York. Dad, let's see. Hey, wait a minute. That fellow that's sitting beside you, is his name John? John. John was my neighbor growing up, and he knows my dad. He knew Dad very well before he passed on. Yeah, you heard some of these stories probably directly from Dad at some point.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. Anything else? If not, I'm going to get out of the way.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay, thank you,
Yep.
folks.
I've got 5 minutes here before 8:30 time slot will be set aside. Anybody have any questions for my presentation? Yes.
In the York Airport on Heath Road, you talked about flights going to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and then the plane, the picture of the plane only had like one seat in it.
Well, it actually.
How many
Okay.
people were normally on the?
Yeah, she asked about the planes at the Airfield Airport on Haynes Road, and how many passengers were in that. That was actually, a passenger could sit right beside the pilot, and then there was 2 behind that and 2 behind that. So that was actually a 6-place airplane, a pilot and 5 passengers. And what they did is, depending on the number, if there was no passenger showed up, the plane still went, but they put freight in. And basically it was like waiting on freight. And if you have enough passengers that you couldn't put the freight on, you wait till the next day to fly it out. So, yeah. Any other questions? If not, thank you for attending. Hope I'll see you again in October.
Thank you.